John Davis never imagined he'd become the father to 6 abandoned sisters, but when their lives collided, it was a decision that would change everything. What he didn't know was that the past they were all running from would one day return and force them to face an impossible choice that could tear their family apart forever. John Davis had always been a man of simple habits. He lived in a small house on the edge of a quiet town, where everyone knew everyone's business. A man in his late 30s, John worked as a carpenter, building furniture for the local community. He kept mostly to himself, not because he didn't like people, but because he was content with his quiet life. Or at least, that's what he thought. One afternoon, while passing by the local orphanage, something pulled at his heart. John didn't usually go there, but he often saw children playing in the yard as he walked by. Their laughter echoed, but behind it, John sensed something deeper: loneliness. John approached the receptionist, an elderly woman named Mrs. Jones, who had been working at the orphanage for over 20 years. She greeted him warmly. "What brings you here today, Mr. Davis?" she asked, her voice gentle. "I'm not really sure," John replied, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "I've just been thinking a lot about the kids. Too many of them get adopted." Mrs. Jones sighed deeply, her eyes drifting to a group of children playing quietly in the corner. "Some do, yes, but there are always those who get left behind. The ones whom no one seems to want." "Why?" John asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Jones hesitated, then spoke softly. "We have a group of sisters, 6 of them. They're the sweetest girls, but no one seems to want to adopt them. They've been here for years." John's heart tightened. Why not? 6 years is a long time. Mrs. Jones gave him a sad smile. "Because they're black, John. People around here, well, they don't think a group of black girls will fit into their families. It's a terrible truth, but it's the way of things." John stood there in silence, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest. What kind of world leaves children behind because of the color of their skin? "Can I meet them?" he asked suddenly. Mrs. Jones blinked in surprise, but she nodded, leading him down a narrow hallway. They stopped in front of a door, and when Mrs. Jones opened it, John saw them. 6 little girls, sitting together on a worn-out rug, huddled close like they were each other's only safety. The oldest, around 12, looked up first. Her dark brown eyes were filled with curiosity and caution. The younger ones followed her lead, staring at John with a mixture of hope and fear. They were quiet, their hands clutching each other for comfort. It was clear they had been through a lot, more than children their age should ever have to endure. John crouched down to their level, offering a gentle smile. "Hi, I'm John." The girls didn't say anything at first. The oldest girl gave a small nod, but the others remained silent. They were scared. They'd seen many people come and go, and none of them had ever taken them home. Why would this man be any different? John didn't know what to say or do. He could feel their fear, and it broke his heart. But deep down, something stirred inside him, a desire to protect them, to give them the love they deserved, but had been denied for so long. Mrs. Jones stood behind him, watching closely. "These are the McKinley sisters," she said softly. "That's Maya, the oldest. Then there's Jasmine, Emma, Leah, Naomi, and baby Grace." John felt a surge of emotion as he looked at them, their innocent faces filled with questions. They didn't trust him yet, but how could they? They'd been abandoned before. For a moment, the room was filled with silence. Then, breaking the silence, John spoke again. "Would you like to come home with me?" The girls exchanged nervous glances. Maya, the oldest, finally spoke up, her voice shaky. "All of us." John nodded. "All of you." The girls didn't know what to say, and neither did John. He was offering them something they hadn't dared to dream of. A home, a family. But could they believe it? Mrs. Jones watched quietly, tears gathering in her eyes. She knew the risks John was taking, adopting 6 children all at once, especially children who had been hurt so much already. But there was something in John's eyes, a determination she hadn't seen before. John stood up. Turning to Mrs. Jones, "I know this won't be easy," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "But I want to give them a chance. They deserve that." As John left the orphanage that day, the whispers in town began. "How can one man take care of 6 girls?" they murmured. What was he thinking? But John wasn't thinking about the gossip. His heart was set on giving those girls a home. He didn't know if they would trust him, if they would ever feel safe. But one thing was certain. John was ready to try. For the first time in his life, he had found something worth fighting for. And as he drove away, the girls watched him from the window, their hearts filled with both hope and fear, wondering if they had finally found the home they had been waiting for all their lives. Bringing the 6 girls home was only the beginning. John had thought about the challenges that might come, but nothing could have truly prepared him for how difficult it would be. The house, once quiet and still, was now filled with noise and energy, but not all of it was the happy kind. Each of the girls carried a weight of their own, a heavy burden of fear and mistrust, making it hard for them to settle in. From the start, John could see it in their eyes. The doubt, the uncertainty. They had been hurt too many times before, abandoned, forgotten, unwanted. They weren't used to love, especially not from a stranger who claimed he wanted to be their father. The walls they'd built around their hearts were thick, and no matter how much John tried, he couldn't seem to break through. Maya, the oldest, was the toughest. She took on the role of protector, always looking after her younger sisters, but she kept herself at a distance from John. She never let her guard down, always watching him with suspicion, as if she was waiting for the day he would leave them, too. "I don't need you," Maya would say when John tried to talk to her. "We've been fine on our own." John's heart ached each time she pushed him away, but he understood. Trust wasn't something Maya could give easily, but still he tried. Every day, he worked to show her he wasn't going anywhere, that he loved her just as much as the others. He cooked their meals, helped with homework, and tucked them in at night. But for Maya, it was never enough. One evening, after a particularly hard day, Maya ran away. It wasn't the first time. John had found her at the park, sitting alone on the swings, her face blank as she stared at the ground. "Maya," John called softly as he approached, but she didn't look up. "I told you, I don't need you," she muttered, her voice full of anger and hurt. John knelt beside her, his heart heavy with the fear that he was losing her. "I know you don't believe me yet," he said gently, "but I'm not leaving. No matter how many times you run, I'll always come looking for you." For a long time, Maya didn't respond. Then, finally, she whispered, "Everyone always leaves." John's heart broke at her words. He wanted to take away her pain, to show her that this time, things were different. But how could he? How could he convince a girl who had spent her whole life being let down that she was finally safe? Back at home, the other girls struggled too. They were scared of getting too comfortable, scared that it wouldn't last. At night, John could hear them whispering to each other, wondering if this was real, if they were finally going to have a family. John worked hard every day, trying to hold everything together. But sometimes it felt like no matter what he did, it wasn't enough. The weight of their pasts hung over them all, and he feared he might never be able to break through. In his quiet moments, John wondered if they would ever truly become a family. The girls had been through so much, and no matter how much love he gave, it seemed like there was always a part of them he couldn't reach. But he wasn't going to give up. He had made a promise to himself and to them. He would keep trying, no matter how long it took. At first, John had hoped the town would welcome his new family. After all, he had lived there his whole life. People knew him, respected him even. But as time went on, whispers began to spread. Everywhere John went, he could feel the judgmental stares, the sideways glances filled with doubt and disdain. People didn't say it to his face, But he knew what they were thinking. Why would he adopt 6 black girls? Doesn't he know what kind of trouble they'll bring? They're not his children. They don't belong here. The town was small, and small towns had a way of making sure everyone's business was everyone's business. The Davis family, once considered normal, was now seen as different, strange even. John could handle the whispers, but what tore at him the most was knowing that the girls felt it too. They could see the way people looked at them, hear the cruel things people said when they thought no one was listening. Maya, always the strongest, started to walk with her head held high, pretending it didn't bother her. But John could see the cracks in her confidence. The younger girls, especially Leah and Naomi, started asking questions at home. "Why don't the other kids talk to us at school, Dad?" Leah had asked one evening, her big brown eyes filled with confusion. John's heart ached at the question, and all he could do was reassure them that people sometimes just didn't understand what they didn't know. But deep down, he feared the truth was much worse. Racism, though often unspoken, was everywhere. And his girls were feeling the sharp edges of it more and more each day. The bullying started soon after. It was subtle at first. The other children would whisper behind their backs, giggle when the girls walked by, and throw mean looks their way. But it didn't take long for things to escalate. One afternoon, Emma came home with tears in her eyes, her usually bright spirit dimmed. "What happened?" John asked, kneeling down in front of her, his heart racing. "They called me a name," Emma whispered, her voice cracking. "They said I didn't belong here. They said I was different because of my skin." John's blood boiled. He had tried to shield his daughters from the harsh realities of the world, but now it was staring them in the face. The pain in Emma's eyes was unbearable, but what made it worse was that she wasn't the only one. The next day, the same thing happened to Maya, and then Leah. It seemed like every day one of the girls came home with a new story about the cruel things other children, and sometimes even adults, had said to them. But the final straw came when Grace, the youngest and most fragile, returned home with her hair pulled out in patches, sobbing uncontrollably. "They said I looked like a monkey," she cried into John's chest, her tiny hands clutching his shirt. John could hardly breathe as he held her. How could children be so cruel? And where were the teachers? The adults who were supposed to protect them? The very next morning, John marched down to the school, his heart thudding in his chest. He wasn't a man who liked confrontation, but his daughters were being hurt, and he wasn't going to stand by and let it happen. When he entered the principal's office, Mrs. Henderson, a stern woman with a no-nonsense attitude, sat behind her desk. John didn't wait for her to speak. "My girls have been bullied every day this week," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "This needs to stop." Mrs. Henderson adjusted her glasses and gave him a tight-lipped smile. "We're aware of the situation, Mr. Davis, and we're handling it." John clenched his fists. "Handling it? My daughter came home in tears because someone said she looked like a monkey. Another had her hair pulled out. How exactly are you handling it?" The principal's expression didn't change. "Kids will be kids, Mr. Davis. It's not unusual for children to tease each other." "This isn't teasing," John said, his voice rising. "This is racism, and it's not something you can just brush aside." Before Mrs. Henderson could respond, another voice chimed in from the doorway. "Maybe if your girls weren't so different, they wouldn't have these problems." John turned to see a group of parents standing behind him, their faces smug and unbothered. One of the fathers, a man John recognized from the town's hardware store, crossed his arms. "You're the one who brought them here, John. Maybe you should have thought about how the rest of us would feel." John took a deep breath, his hands trembling with anger. "How dare you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with a fierce protectiveness. "These girls deserve the same love and respect as anyone else in this town. The fact that you can't see that is shameful." The parents shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. "I will not let you or anyone else treat my daughters like they're less than human," John continued, his voice stronger now. "And if the school won't protect them, then I will." With that, John stormed out of the office, his heart pounding. Outside, the sun was shining, but all he could feel was the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on him. The girls were waiting for him at home, and when he returned, they gathered around him, sensing that something had happened. But for the first time, they didn't just see John as their adoptive father. They saw him as their protector. And even though the world outside their door was cruel, inside their home, they knew they had someone who would fight for them, no matter what. As the days went on, the bullying didn't stop, but neither did John's love. The bond between him and the girls grew stronger, and while the town may have turned against them, the Davis family held each other tighter. They were beginning to learn that family wasn't just about blood. It was about standing up for one another, no matter how hard things got. And in that, they found their strength. Things were finally starting to settle down for the Davis family. The whispers in town hadn't stopped, but inside their home, the girls were laughing again. The nights of tearful questions had faded into warm dinners, and even Maya had started to soften, allowing John to get closer. The bond between them, though fragile, was growing stronger each day. John's heart swelled with pride as he watched his daughters come into their own, finding comfort in the family they were building together. But just when things seemed to be improving, the first crack appeared. It started with Jasmine. She was the quiet one, always the peacemaker, the soft voice in the middle of the sisters' disagreements. But lately, John noticed she had become more distant. At first, he thought it was just her age. After all, she was 11 now, on the cusp of being a teenager. But it was more than that. She wasn't just pulling away from him. She was pulling away from her sisters too. She no longer joined in their games, often choosing to sit by herself, staring out the window as if waiting for something or someone. One evening, while John was preparing dinner, the doorbell rang. It was unusual for them to have visitors, especially this late in the day. John wiped his hands on a towel and made his way to the door, not expecting the woman who stood on the porch. She looked nervous. "Can I help you?" he asked. The woman's gaze flickered toward the house before she spoke. "I'm looking for Jasmine," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm her mother." John's world seemed to stop in that moment. He felt as though the ground beneath him was crumbling. Her mother? How could this be? The girls had been abandoned. There had never been any word from their biological family. And now, after all this time, this woman stood before him, claiming to be Jasmine's mother. John's first instinct was to protect. He wanted to tell her to leave, that Jasmine didn't need her, that she had a family now. But he also knew this wasn't a decision he could make alone. His hands trembled as he called for Jasmine, his voice tight with emotion. When Jasmine came to the door and saw the woman, her face went pale. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen, before the woman reached out to her. "Jasmine, it's me, sweetheart," she said softly, tears filling her eyes. "I know I made mistakes. I know I left. But I'm here now. I want you to come home with me." John's heart broke as he watched the confusion and pain wash over Jasmine's face. She looked back and forth between the woman and John, torn between the family she had grown to love and the mother who had suddenly reappeared. I don't know," Jasmine stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. John knelt down beside her, his voice soft but steady. "You don't have to make any decisions right now, Jasmine. We're your family, no matter what." But the seed had already been planted. Over the next few days, Jasmine became even more distant. The other girls noticed it too, and the tension in the house grew unbearable. The sisters whispered amongst themselves, unsure of what to say or do. They could feel Jasmine slipping away, and it terrified them. One night, after another quiet dinner where Jasmine barely spoke, she finally broke the silence. "I'm going to leave," she said softly, but her words hit like a hammer. The room fell silent. Leah, Naomi, and Emma looked at her in shock. while Grace's eyes filled with tears. Maya, who rarely showed emotion, clenched her fists, her jaw tightening. John felt like he had been punched in the gut. "Jasmine, you don't have to do this," he pleaded, his voice shaking. "We're your family. We love you." "I know," Jasmine whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But she's my real mom. I need to know. I need to find out if I belong with her." John's heart shattered as he saw the pain in her eyes. He had worked so hard to give Jasmine and her sisters a home, to make them feel like they belonged. And now, despite all of his efforts, she was walking away. He felt like he had failed her, like he wasn't enough. The night Jasmine packed her things was the hardest night of John's life. The other girls cried themselves to sleep, and John spent the night pacing the floor, unsure of how to fix what was happening. He couldn't help but wonder if Jasmine would ever come back, or if this was the beginning of the end for their family. The next morning, the house felt empty without Jasmine's presence. The sisters were devastated, feeling like a piece of their family had been ripped away. Maya was the angriest, her frustration spilling over into every conversation. "She abandoned us," Maya snapped one day. "She doesn't care about us, or about Dad." John tried to hold the family together, but the tension was overwhelming. He felt like everything he had worked for was falling apart. The girls were angry and heartbroken, and John himself was struggling to keep his emotions in check. He had never felt so powerless. Every night, the girls cried for Jasmine, and every night John wondered if she would ever return. The house that had once been filled with laughter now echoed with silence, the empty space where Jasmine used to sit a constant reminder of the hole she had left behind. As the days turned into weeks, John could only hope that, somehow, they would survive this loss. But in his heart, he feared that things would never be the same again. In the weeks following Jasmine's departure, the house felt like it had lost some of its warmth. John did his best to keep things normal for the remaining 5 girls, but the void Jasmine had left was felt deeply by everyone. The sisters were quieter, more withdrawn, and even the smallest things seemed to set off emotional waves that rippled through the family. John feared the worst, that the family he had worked so hard to build was starting to fall apart. Maya had become more distant than ever, spending long hours alone in her room. John gave her space, but he worried. She had always been the toughest, but there was a heaviness in her now that even he couldn't reach. He suspected it was more than just Jasmine's absence. One rainy afternoon, the tension in the house finally came to a head. Maya had been unusually silent at the dinner table, her eyes fixed on her plate, barely touching her food. The younger girls were talking softly, but the sadness in their voices was unmistakable. As John cleared the dishes, he noticed Maya stand abruptly and head toward the door. "Maya, where are you going?" John called after her, his voice gentle but concerned. She stopped, her back still turned to him. "I need to get out of here," she muttered, her voice tight with emotion. John followed her out onto the porch, where the rain drizzled lightly. Maya stood there, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if shielding herself from something far worse than the rain. John approached cautiously, his heart heavy. "Maya," he began softly, "I know things have been hard since Jasmine left. But I need you to know that no matter what, we're still a family. I'm here for you." Maya didn't respond right away. She stared out into the rain, her jaw clenched, and for a moment, John thought she wasn't going to say anything at all. But then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper, as if releasing a truth she had been holding onto for too long. "You don't understand, Dad. It's not just about Jasmine leaving. It's about why she left." John frowned, stepping closer. "What do you mean?" Maya turned to face him, and the pain in her eyes was unmistakable. She took a shaky breath before speaking again. "I know why our mother left us. I know the real reason she didn't want us anymore." John felt a cold chill run through him. He had always suspected there was more to the story, but the girls had never talked about their past in detail, and John had respected their silence. Now, it seemed that a dark secret was finally coming to light. Maya looked down at the ground, her voice trembling as she spoke. Our mom. She didn't leave us because she couldn't take care of us. She left because she didn't want us to know the truth. She was running from something terrible. John's heart pounded in his chest. He gently placed a hand on Maya's shoulder. Maya, you don't have to carry this alone. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. Maya hesitated, then looked up at John, her eyes filled with fear. Dad, our mother was involved with dangerous people. That's why she left. She didn't want us to be a part of it. She knew they'd come after us if she stayed. John's mind raced as he tried to process what she had just told him. Dangerous people. His heart ached for the girls, for everything they had endured without ever speaking of it. He felt a surge of protectiveness rise up in him, stronger than ever before. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? John asked gently. Maya wiped her eyes, her voice cracking. I didn't want to remember. I thought, if I didn't say it, it would just go away. But it never did. I've always known, and I think Jasmine knew too. That's why she left. She thought going back to our mom would give her the answers. John's breath caught in his throat. Jasmine hadn't left just because she felt lost. She had been searching for something, searching for the truth about their past. Maya's voice grew softer, almost a whisper. I'm scared, Dad. What if they come after us? What if they find us? John knelt in front of her, gently taking her hands in his. Maya, listen to me. Whatever happened in the past, it's not your fault. It's not any of your fault. You girls didn't deserve to be abandoned, and you don't deserve to carry this burden. I promised to protect you when I became your father, and I will. No matter what. Maya looked into his eyes, searching for reassurance. But what if they find us? John's grip on her hands tightened, his voice steady. I won't let anything happen to you or your sisters. I'll protect you, Maya. We'll face this together, as a family. For the first time, Maya let her guard down. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she threw her arms around John, sobbing into his chest. John held her tightly, his own heart breaking for the fear and pain she had been carrying for so long. That night, John gathered the other girls in the living room. The truth had to come out, as much as it hurt. Maya sat beside him, her face still pale from the emotional release, and as John began to explain what had been revealed, the younger girls' faces filled with fear. We don't have to be scared of the past, John said, his voice gentle but firm. Whatever happened, it's over. You girls are safe now. You have each other, and you have me. Nothing will change that. The girls huddled close together, and though the fear of the unknown still lingered, there was a glimmer of hope in their eyes. They had been abandoned once, but now they had a father who would protect them, no matter what dark secrets came to light. The days after Maya's confession, the family began to heal. John had hoped that with time, the wounds would scab over, and they could move forward as a stronger unit. But as much as they tried, the absence of Jasmine still hung over them like a shadow. The girls missed her, even if none of them said it out loud. John missed her too. Then, one evening, there was a knock at the door. It was Jasmine. She stood there on the porch, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked smaller, more fragile than when she had left. In her arms was a small bag, as if she hadn't meant to stay away for so long but didn't know how to come back. For a moment, they just stared at each other, both unsure of what to say. Dad. Jasmine's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with emotion. Can I come home? John didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and pulled her into a tight hug, holding her as if he was afraid she might disappear again if he let go. He could feel her sobbing into his chest, her body shaking with the weight of all the emotions she had been holding back. I'm so sorry, she cried. I made a mistake. I thought she was where I belonged, but I was wrong. My family is here, with you and my sisters. John's heart ached as he held her. He had longed for this moment, but he knew that it wouldn't be easy. The sisters had felt abandoned when Jasmine left, especially Maya. They had grown closer in her absence, and her return would stir up old wounds. "Let's go inside," John said softly, guiding her into the house. When Jasmine stepped into the living room, the rest of the family was sitting together. The room fell silent as the sisters stared at her, disbelief written across their faces. Jasmine stood awkwardly by the door, her eyes darting from one sister to the next, waiting for someone to speak. It was Maya who broke the silence. She stood up, her face a mixture of anger and hurt. "What are you doing here?" she asked coldly, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Jasmine winced at her tone but didn't back down. "I came back. I made a mistake, Maya. I'm sorry." Maya's eyes narrowed. "You left us, Jasmine. You abandoned us. You didn't care about what that did to us." "That's not true," Jasmine said, her voice cracking. "I thought I needed to know my real mom. I didn't realize what I was leaving behind." "You knew exactly what you were doing," Maya shot back, her voice rising with anger. "You left because you wanted something better. You thought we weren't enough for you. Well, now you want to come back and pretend like nothing happened, like we're just supposed to forgive you." The tension in the room was suffocating. The younger girls looked back and forth between their sisters, unsure of what to do. Leah had tears in her eyes, and Emma looked like she was about to cry too. Naomi and Grace stayed quiet, clinging to each other for comfort. John stood between them, his heart breaking as he watched the argument unfold. He had to say something before things got worse. "Maya." "Enough," John said, stepping forward. "We need to listen to Jasmine." But Maya wasn't ready to forgive. "No, Dad. She doesn't deserve it. She didn't care about us when she left. Why should we care now?" Jasmine took a deep breath, tears streaming down her face. "I know I hurt you all. I was confused, and I made a selfish choice. But I realized that I don't belong with her. I belong here with you. I miss you all so much, and I'm begging you to forgive me." For a moment, the room was silent again, but the air was thick with unresolved pain. Maya shook her head, her voice trembling with emotion. "You can't just walk back into our lives and expect things to be the same. You broke us when you left. You broke me." Jasmine stepped forward, her voice desperate. "I'm not asking for everything to be the same. I just want a chance to make things right. Please, Maya, you're my sister. I love you." Maya's anger faltered for a moment, but her walls were still up. She turned away, blinking back tears. "It's not that easy." The other girls remained quiet, watching their two older sisters in a moment of raw vulnerability. Leah, who had always been more sensitive, finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I missed you, Jasmine. I was really mad when you left, but I missed you." Jasmine's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Leah. "I missed you too. I missed all of you." John could see the pain and love in the room, battling for control. He knew this was a pivotal moment for their family. If they didn't heal now, the damage might become irreparable. "Maya," John said softly, turning to her, "I know it's hard to forgive. You have every right to be angry, but we're a family. We've been through so much together. If we don't find a way to forgive each other, we'll lose everything we've built." Maya stayed quiet for a long time, her back still turned to Jasmine. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft, but filled with emotion. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Jasmine, but I don't want to lose you either." Jasmine stepped forward cautiously, tears still streaming down her face. "I'll prove it to you, Maya. I'll prove that I belong here, that I love you. Just give me a chance." Maya finally turned around, her eyes meeting Jasmine's. The hurt was still there, but there was something else too, hope. Slowly, Maya stepped forward, and to everyone's surprise, she pulled Jasmine into a tight embrace. The two sisters clung to each other, their tears mixing as the weight of the past began to lift. The other girls, seeing the moment unfold, rushed to join them, wrapping their arms around their sisters. The room was filled with quiet sobs, but this time, It wasn't just from pain. It was from the beginning of healing. John watched with tears in his own eyes, his heart swelling with both relief and gratitude. His family was far from perfect, and there would be many challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hope. They had survived Jasmine's leaving, and now they would survive her return. The Davis family had just begun to find their rhythm again. After Jasmine's return, the wounds between the sisters were slowly healing, and the warmth that had been missing for so long was creeping back into the house. Laughter, once lost, had returned, and John found himself filled with a deep sense of pride and relief. His girls were coming together, stronger than ever. One morning, as John was preparing breakfast, he felt a strange, sharp pain in his chest. It wasn't the usual tiredness from a long day's work or the aches of getting older. It was something more. He tried to shake it off, but the pain didn't go away. It got worse. His vision blurred, and the room began to spin. Clutching the edge of the counter, he collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The sound of his fall echoed through the house, and within moments, the girls rushed into the kitchen. Maya was the first to reach him. She dropped to her knees, her heart pounding in terror as she shook John's shoulders. "Dad, Dad, can you hear me?" she cried, panic filling her voice. The other girls huddled around, their faces pale with fear. Jasmine was already on the phone with 911, her hand shaking as she gave their address to the operator. Grace, the youngest, clung to Leah, tears streaming down her face. None of them had ever seen John like this, so vulnerable, so weak. He had always been their rock, the one who held everything together. When the ambulance arrived, the girls could only watch in horror as the paramedics lifted John onto a stretcher. His eyes were half open, and he tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Maya gripped his hand tightly, tears blurring her vision. "Dad, please don't leave us," she whispered as they loaded him into the ambulance. The girls followed the ambulance to the hospital, their hearts heavy with fear. In the waiting room, time seemed to slow down. Hours passed without any news. Each of them sat in silence, trying to process what was happening. The man who had saved them, who had been the only parent they had ever truly known, was lying in a hospital bed, and they didn't know if he would come back. Maya, always the strong one, stood apart from her sisters, staring blankly at the hospital walls. The weight of everything pressed down on her. She had always taken on the role of protector. But this was something she couldn't control. The fear of losing John, the fear of what would happen to their family without him, overwhelmed her. "Why isn't he getting better?" Leah asked, her voice trembling. Jasmine sat beside her, trying to hold back her own tears. "We just have to wait, Leah. The doctors are doing everything they can." But waiting was the hardest part. After several days in the hospital, the doctors gave the family the news. John had suffered a heart attack. He was stable now, but the recovery would be long and difficult. He would be in the hospital for a while. And even after that, he would need months of rest and rehabilitation. The girls were devastated, but they knew they had no choice. They would have to carry on without John for a while. Maya, despite her own fear and exhaustion, stepped up as the leader of the family. She took on John's responsibilities, making sure the house ran smoothly and that her sisters were taken care of. At first, it seemed like she could handle it. She made sure they all got to school on time, cooked meals, and kept up with John's business as best she could. But the pressure of being responsible for everything quickly became overwhelming. Maya wasn't just worried about the day-to-day tasks. She was terrified of losing John, of what would happen if he didn't come home. The weight of it all was too much for her to carry alone. One night, as the sisters sat around the dinner table, Maya broke down. She slammed her fist onto the table, tears spilling down her face. "I can't do this," she cried. "I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm so scared he's not going to make it. What if we lose him? What if we lose everything?" The other girls were silent, their own fears reflected in Maya's words. Jasmine, who had been quiet since John's heart attack, stood up and walked over to Maya, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone, Maya," Jasmine said softly. "None of us are. We don't have to do this by ourselves. We can do it together." Maya looked up, her eyes filled with doubt. "But what if it's not enough? What if we're not enough?" Jasmine knelt beside her, her voice steady. "We've been through so much already. We survived being abandoned. We survived me leaving. And we'll survive this too. Dad's not gone. And as long as we're together, we're going to be okay." Leah, Emma, Naomi, and Grace all nodded in agreement, their faces filled with determination. In that moment, Maya realized she didn't have to carry the burden alone. They were a family, and they would face this test together. Over the next few weeks, the sisters leaned on each other like never before. They shared responsibilities, took turns visiting John in the hospital, and supported each other through the uncertainty and fear. The bond between them grew stronger, not because things were easy, but because they had no choice but to trust in each other. And through it all, they kept hoping. Hoping that John would come home. Hoping that they would make it through, stronger than ever. John's recovery was slow, but every day brought a little more hope. After weeks in the hospital and months of rehabilitation, he finally returned home. The girls were overjoyed to have him back, and their house once again felt whole. They had grown in his absence, learning to rely on each other and themselves, but having John home brought a sense of peace none of them realized they had been missing. Life began to settle into a new rhythm. Maya continued to step into a leadership role within the family, but she no longer carried the weight alone. Jasmine, having returned for good, made amends with her sisters, proving her commitment to their bond. Leah, Emma, Naomi, and Grace found their own ways to contribute, each girl coming into her own. The Davis household, once filled with uncertainty, was now filled with love and strength. Then, one day, there was another unexpected knock at the door. John had been resting in his chair, the girls scattered around the house, when he heard the knock. He opened the door to find a face he hadn't seen in years, the girl's biological mother. Her appearance was shocking. She looked older, worn down by life, her eyes filled with sorrow. She stood awkwardly on the porch, clutching her hands together, as if she didn't know whether to step forward or run away. "John," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I'm not here to take them away. I'm here to ask for forgiveness." John's heart pounded in his chest. This was the woman who had left the girls, abandoned them to a life of uncertainty. And now, after all these years, she stood before him, asking for something he wasn't sure he could give. "I made a terrible mistake," she continued, her voice cracking. "I was scared, and I didn't know how to be a mother. I thought they'd be better off without me, but I see now that I was wrong. I see how strong they've become because of you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to come and tell them I'm sorry. I needed to tell them the truth." John stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing. He knew this decision wasn't his alone. The girls had built a life, a family, without her, and he couldn't let this woman disrupt everything they had worked so hard to achieve. But at the same time, he could see the sincerity in her eyes. She was broken, filled with regret, and he wondered if the girls needed this moment of closure, even if it would be difficult. "Wait here," John said quietly, stepping back into the house. He called the girls into the living room, his heart heavy with the decision they would soon face. They gathered around him, sensing the seriousness of the situation from the look on his face. "What's wrong, Dad?" Maya asked, her brow furrowing in concern. John took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "There's someone here who wants to talk to you. It's your mother." The room went still. The girls stared at him, their faces a mix of shock, confusion, and for some, anger. Jasmine, who had already been through the pain of reconnecting with their mother, lowered her gaze, unsure of how to feel. "She says she's not here to take you away," John continued, "but to apologize. She wants to ask for your forgiveness. A heavy silence fell over the room as the girls absorbed his words. Maya's expression darkened. She had always been the most protective, the most hurt by their mother's abandonment. Leah and Emma exchanged nervous glances, while Naomi and Grace looked unsure, their young faces filled with questions they didn't know how to ask. "I'll leave this up to you," John said softly. "Whatever you decide, I'll stand by you. But you need to hear her out and make the choice yourselves." The girls nodded slowly, and John led them to the door. Their mother stood there, her eyes brimming with tears as she looked at the daughters she had left behind so many years ago. "I know I don't deserve it," she began, her voice trembling. "But I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. I was selfish and I was scared, and I thought you'd be better off without me. But I see now that I was wrong. You've grown into such incredible young women, and I know that's because of John. I can never take back what I did, but I'm asking for your forgiveness if you can find it in your hearts to give it." The girls stood frozen, the weight of their past pressing down on them. For a moment, it seemed like none of them would speak. Then, to everyone's surprise, it was Grace, the youngest, who stepped forward first. Her small voice was quiet but firm as she said, "We have a family now." Their mother's face crumpled with emotion, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know," she whispered. "I just needed to tell you I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try." The other girls looked to Maya, waiting for her response. Maya's face was a mixture of anger and sorrow, her jaw clenched tightly. She had been the one to protect them all those years, and now the person who had caused them so much pain was standing in front of her, asking for forgiveness. Finally, Maya spoke, her voice hard but filled with emotion. "You hurt us," she said. "You left us when we needed you most. But John became our father. He gave us the love and safety you didn't, and that's the only reason we survived." Their mother nodded, her tears flowing freely now. "I know, Maya. I know." Maya paused, looking at her sisters, then back at her mother. "I don't know if I can forgive you, not yet, but I'm not going to let your mistakes keep holding us back. We have a family, and we're strong. We've moved forward." The other girls, following Maya's lead, nodded in agreement. Jasmine stepped forward next, adding softly, "We've learned how to love because of John, and because of each other." John, who had been watching from the sidelines, felt a swell of pride in his heart. His girls, the once unwanted, abandoned sisters, had grown into strong, compassionate young women. They had faced their past, and though it wasn't easy, they had found the strength to move forward. Their mother, overwhelmed with emotion, whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for listening. I wish you all the happiness in the world." As she turned to leave, John gathered his daughters into a tight embrace. They had faced their ultimate test and come out stronger on the other side. The town, once judgmental and filled with doubt, now admired the unity and resilience of the Davis family. And as they stood together, John knew that his love for them, and their love for each other, had made them whole. They were no longer the unwanted girls. They were a family, bound by a love that had grown stronger with every challenge they had faced. For the first time, they all knew that love, even when tested, would always prevail. Enjoying the content? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an update. And while you're here, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We love hearing from viewers around the world. Your support means everything, and we can't wait to connect with you.